If your team isn't using ClickUp, you're wasting time, and data proves it. 61% of knowledge workers manage work more than doing it, switching apps 1,000 times a day. That's work sprawl and costs millions. ClickUp replaces 20 apps with Convergence, uniting projects, docs, and chats, while AI super agents handle the busy work. Join 4 million teams using ClickUp to finish work 30% faster. Try it free and get 15% off AI upgrades at clickup.com/podcast. That's CLICKUP.com/podcast.
Why choose a Sleep Number smart bed?
Can I make my site softer?
Can I make my site firmer? Can we sleep cooler?
Sleep Number does that. Cools up to 8 times faster and lets you choose your ideal comfort on either side, your Sleep Number setting. Enjoy personalized comfort for better sleep night after night. And now, during our President's Day sale, take 50% off our limited edition bed. Plus, free premium delivery with any bed and base. Ends Monday. Only at a Sleep Number store or sleepnumber.com.
Today's episode is brought to you by Amantara. Amantara is an education-first plant and mushroom wellness brand, and they specialise in providing dietary supplements that can aid your well-being. Amanita muscaria is a legal mushroom that is traditionally associated with relaxation and nervous system calm. As somebody who has issues around anxiety and sleep, I am always looking for dietary supplements that may aid in reducing the levels of anxiety that I experience and just make my brain feel a little bit calmer. Amanita is used by adults all over the US as part of a wind down or evening routine. Amantara is a brand that emphasises transparency, responsible use and education. Their website is full of information about Amanita muscaria and its potential benefits. As with any dietary supplement, it is incredibly important to consult your medical provider before trying it. To learn more about Amanita muscaria and Amantara's approach, visit amantara.com. That's amantara.com. Hello and welcome to episode number 307 of Real Life Ghost Stories. And to kick things off this week, I would like to say thanks to some of our newest Patreon subscribers. I would like to thank Siobhan Nolan, Joe Lorty, Caroline Woolstenholme, and Sky. Thank you so much for subscribing to the Patreon. I love you and appreciate you every single day. And we have a promo this week. Now, it's been a while since we've had a promo, and this week's promo is for the podcast The Chick and the Duck. Two best friends, one friend's rewatch. Join the Chick and the Duck, also known as Sarah and Stephen, as they revisit every episode of the iconic sitcom. They'll be sharing insights, bloopers, behind the scenes trivia, and relating all those plot lines to their own chaotic lives. It's nostalgia, laughter, and a little bit of therapy. It's like rewatching Friends, but with your actual friends. I mean, is there anything better than a comfort rewatch of Friends? I think for all millennials, it was such a comfort TV show, and we know elements of it now are problematic, etc. And you go back and you watch episodes and you go, oh, I don't remember that. Also, it's really nice, I think, to see if other people's opinions like match up with yours. I always find that really interesting. And of course, as always, the link to where you can find the Chick and the Duck podcast is in the description of this episode. Please, 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 if it sounds like your thing, go and check it out. Indie podcasting is really hard. It is really hard to get your work out there. So if it sounds like your thing, please go and check out the Chick and the Duck podcast.
I'm the Chick.
And I'm the Duck.
We are two best friends doing one Friends rewatch.
Each week, we rewatch an episode of Friends, breaking down the jokes, the chaos, the questionable fashion,
and the moments that hit way too close to home.
We talk trivia, continuity errors, iconic lines, and how these storylines somehow mirror our lives.
Bad dates, friendship drama, career panic, it's basically therapy with a lot of laughing.
If Friends is your comfort show,
or you just love listening to two friends overshare,
this podcast is for you.
Subscribe to The Chick and the Duck, available now wherever you get your podcasts.
Could we be more excited?
Which brings us to our film review this week. Our film review is Send Help. Send Help was released in 2026. It has 7.2 out of 10 on IMDb and 93% on Rotten Tomatoes. A woman and her insufferable boss become stranded on a deserted island after a plane crash. They must overcome past grievances and work together to survive. But ultimately, it's a battle of wills and wits to make it out alive. Do you know what? This film was just so fun to watch. I really enjoyed it. It is full of the best of Sam Raimi, and the gore and the horror are just campy and ridiculous. So if you are unfamiliar with Sam Raimi's style of directing, it tends to be like gore, blood, heavy, but definitely in a more comedic way. And the jump scares I find with Sam Raimi will often they'll make you jump and then make you laugh, you know. And I really enjoy his style of film, because if you know what you're going into, you know that you're not going to be walking away being like, oh my God, that was so unnecessarily gory and gross. You know it's going to be gory, but you also know it's going to be campy and ridiculous, which is what you want. And I thought it was very Sam Raimi in all of his best ways. There were moments of great gore in the film where there was like excessive blood, etc. But there were also moments of jump scares, right? Where I watched it in the cinema, so I was desperate to like pause the screen or scroll back 10 seconds so that I could see the actual face that made me jump, because I knew in that split second that I saw that it was really ridiculous, over the top. You know, this face that you wouldn't find scary. It kind of wouldn't be out of place in like a Tim Burton movie, you know. And I just wanted to rewind and watch it. So it's definitely one that I will be rewatching when it comes out on streaming. And I did think the story was great. Like Rachel McAdams, The Woman You Are, love her, love watching her, was fantastic. And Dylan O'Brien, who plays her boss, was also fantastic. They are so fun to watch. The first kind of 15-20 minutes of the film, you're watching her life, and so many cringy things happen to her, and she's like working really hard and deserves a promotion and all those things. And the kind of the workplace dynamics are so difficult to watch, and you really feel for her. Like, you are rooting for her. And Dylan O'Brien is a knob, and he plays it really well, and you have these ever-shifting power dynamics that are just great. They're so entertaining, and I imagined when I was watching it that they had a really good time filming it. I felt like they were probably going, how far can we push this moment? How far can we push this joke in the best possible way? I love a remote desert island story. I love a story where a man gets his comeuppance, and you just get that in this film in spades. And you know, there's things to dislike, right? Sometimes, like I said, it's very gory, very gruesome, and some of the gore and scares are quite, you know, poorly CGI'd. But that's what Sam Raimi does, and I know some people hate it, right? So I knew what it was going to be like when I went in, so I was prepared. I enjoyed it. I like that kind of style, but I can see that it might not be for everybody. The other thing that I will say about this film is that it is not subtle in any way, shape or form. We are talking about a story that is about toxic masculinity, the patriarchy, this finance bro culture, and a woman who is not considered to be conventionally attractive being overlooked in the workplace and not being seen as important, right? And of course you're watching and you're going, Rachel McAdams being presented as a not conventionally attractive woman is crazy, right? And, you know, there's times when it made me roll my eyes when she's when they're trying to present her as this like dowdy, unattractive, kind of accident prone woman. I was like, oh, right, yeah, we get it. Equally, the men in the story are exactly how you imagine finance bro culture amplified by 100. You know, it's almost like Wolf of Wall Street-esque, these men in this office. There's no grace, there's no nuance. It just is what it is. Sometimes that's okay, you know. Again, it's very Sam Raimi. It's getting the point across. And it is categorically hitting you repeatedly over the head with that point. And I don't know if this is just me, right? I've watched a horror film every week for the last, 8 years, maybe. And as a result, I do find a lot of horror films incredibly predictable. And I don't know if it was the writing in this one, or if it's just because I've seen so many that, you know, films all follow a certain pattern or a narrative arc, right? And I just felt like where the film went, for me, felt quite obvious. I wasn't remotely shocked or surprised, and it doesn't mean I didn't enjoy it, but it just meant that I kind of had figured out where it was going quite early on, and I was expecting it. But would I recommend that you watch it? Yeah, I definitely would recommend it. I don't think it's world beating, but I think it's very enjoyable, and I think the two leads put in two fantastic performances. And for that reason, I'm giving Send Help 3.5 stars. As a complete aside, which is not relevant to Send Help at all, well, maybe it is because it is also Desert Island themed, there is a new adaptation of The Lord of the Flies on BBC. If you are in the UK, you can access it on BBC iPlayer, and I'm sure there are potentially other ways to access it from elsewhere in the world. But there is a new adaptation of Lord of the Flies, and it is fantastic. It is so good. It is 4 episodes long, I think, and it deals with the kind of main characters in Lord of the Flies. It is so beautifully shot. It's actually quite freaky. Like, there's elements of it that are quite creepy to watch and quite scary, which I was surprised by. I mean, you know, the kids are all quite scared in the novel, so it makes sense that it would be filmed in almost a horror movie-esque kind of way. But I can highly recommend checking that out if you want something quite spooky to watch that has its roots in literature. And I can only watch 1 episode at a time because I find the soundtrack, the music, I find the way that it's filmed overwhelming in a good way. So can highly recommend Lord of the Flies, the new adaptation on BBC, if you're looking for something to sink your teeth into.
ClickUp just solved AI's biggest problem, and it's saving 4 million teams from productivity loss every day. Unlike ChatGPT and other AI tools, ClickUp converges all your work into one platform, so your AI super agents have full context to prioritize tasks, execute workflows, and draft documents instantly. Teams using ClickUp finish work 30% faster and cut meetings in half. Try ClickUp for free today and get 15% off AI upgrades at clickup.com/podcast. That's CLICKUP.com/podcast.
Why choose a Sleep Number smart bed?
Can I make my site softer?
Can I make my site firmer? Can we sleep cooler?
Sleep Number does that. Cools up to 8 times faster and lets you choose your ideal comfort on either side, your Sleep Number setting. Enjoy personalized comfort for better sleep night after night. And now, during our President's Day sale, take 50% off our limited edition bed. Plus, free premium delivery with any bed and base. Ends Monday. Only at a Sleep Number store or sleepnumber.com.
You know what's wild? Most people are still overpaying for car insurance just because it's a pain to switch. That's why there's Jerry. Jerry's the only app that compares rates from over 50 insurers in minutes and helps you switch fast with no spam calls or hidden fees. Drivers who save with Jerry could save over $1,300 a year. Before you renew your car insurance policy, do yourself a favor. Download the Jerry app or head to jerry.ai/ACAST.
Hi, this is Matt from P1 with Matt and Tommy, and this episode is sponsored by eBay. The cars you'll find on eBay are just different. They come with a story that you can't wait to share. Like this 1973 Dodge Charger on eBay that has been tucked away in an Arizona barn for over 40 years, only 55,000 miles, and somehow in great running order. It even has a rare sunroof. Suddenly, a car that was hidden for decades is being delivered in just a few clicks with eBay's secure purchase. All the paperwork handled. There are thousands of cars on eBay, from unique finds like the Pontiac Grand Prix SJ to daily drivers, and now with a new way to buy them. eBay. Things people love.
Which brings us to our story this week. Now, if you're a Patreon subscriber, you will know that I have been sifting through my huge collection of paranormal books. I'm trying to whittle them down, right? Because I have a lot. I find them in various, secondhand shops and online secondhand, and I go, "Ooh, that looks interesting," and then I buy them, and then I add them to the shelf, and then I promptly forget about them. So I've been looking through my paranormal books, and I found a copy of Arthur C. Clarke's Mysterious World, which is really, really good fun. And in it, there was a section that was entitled Giants. Now, I've spoken about this before. I love giant stories. I love fairy stories. I love giant stories. And that little section in the book actually ended up being not very fruitful, but it inspired this episode. And we are going to be diving into stories of giants from around the world, which are eyewitness accounts, but also accounts of people who have found the remains of giants. So let's get into it. There are many types of stories in the world of folklore. Stories from all over the world. Stories from different countries, different counties, different towns and villages. Some of these stories are wild and wacky and thoroughly entertaining. Some are truly terrifying and cause you to question your very belief system. Some folklore is universal, like the stories of phantom hitchhikers. Where there are cars, there are car accidents, and where there are car accidents, there are phantom hitchhikers. Fairy lore is a universal folklore. Fairies, elves, gnomes, duendes, goblins and pixies exist all over the world. And on the other end of the spectrum, there are giants. We often think of giants as something that are confined to storybooks. But there are so many stories of humans encountering what they believed to be giants. When I was a child, I learned all about the Fomorians, a race of giants who were agents of chaos, who lived underneath the land or the sea in Ireland. There were stories of heroes like the legendary Cuchulainn, who literally transformed into a giant on the battlefield. In the book, The Stories We Carry in Our Bones, Irish History for Americans, folklorist Juliene Osborne McKnight says, "He grows to 9 feet tall, blood spurts from his forehead, one of his eyes bulges from its socket, his head can turn 360 degrees like the head of an owl. Once he enters the war spasm or riastra, he cannot be defeated." The Giant's Causeway in Antrim in the north of Ireland was made by the giant Fionn McCool in order to fight an enemy Scottish giant. The stories in Irish folklore are endless, and there are stories from across the world. But what of our relatively modern times? What are the stories of giants that may suggest that these gargantuan creatures may not be confined to the annals of folklore? It was the 16th of October 1869, and a group of men had just made a very strange discovery. They were on William C. Newell's farm and building a well when they found it. Just below the surface of the soil was a large, petrified foot. A human-looking foot, but much, much bigger. He had called the other men over and they had stood around the huge foot trying to make sense of what they were seeing. It had been buried just below the surface of the soil, and as they dug around it, they quickly uncovered a whole mummified body, or maybe it was petrified. It was a huge human man, 10 feet and 4.5 inches tall. He weighed 3,000 pounds, and he became known as the Cardiff Giant. Cardiff was a small, unremarkable village in New York State, and by the next day, word had gotten round that William C. Newell had a giant on his farm. People flocked to see it. They were desperate to catch a glimpse of this phenomenon. Newell saw an opportunity and, well, he capitalised on it. He erected a tent over the giant and charged the baying crowds 50 cents to view the giant for 15 whole minutes. In this time, they could survey the creature but also hear a lecture on this newly discovered wonder. The town boomed. Shops sold out of goods, and in nearby bigger towns, boarding rooms sold out. The farmer Newell made what money he could from charging people to see the spectacle, and then he sold the giant to some wealthy businessmen. The giant was put on show in the nearby town of Syracuse. Of course, scientists were scrambling for a look. Charles Darwin's The Origin of Species had only been published 10 years before, and this was the perfect time to put his new and novel theories about evolution to the test. 4 doctors examined the giant and insisted that the object had categorically once been a real, living being. An investigator went on record to say that anyone who believed that the giant was a fake had simply declared himself a fool. A hole was drilled in its skull, and an investigator described in detail the intricacies of the cranial anatomy of this giant humanoid. Except he was a fake. The giant was a fairly complex and well-orchestrated hoax. And it was a hoax that had been born out of what was ostensibly a petty argument. A relative of the farmer and a cigar manufacturer named George Hull had had an argument with a revivalist preacher named Reverend Turk. Hull and Turk had had this intense argument about the existence of giants. The Reverend believed that their mention in Genesis meant that there had been literal giants on earth, whereas Hull was agnostic, and he didn't believe that the Bible should be interpreted so literally. In order to teach the Reverend a lesson, Hull had procured a large block of gypsum. He had sent the block to Chicago, where it was carved into the shape of a giant human by two sculptors. He then inserted darning needles all over the stone and hammered it to make it appear mottled and porous like petrified human skin. He finally covered it in sulfuric acid for an aged appearance and transported it back to Newell's farm for it to be buried and to await the fruits of his labour. And his plan was more successful than his wildest dreams. He and Newell had made a huge amount of money and had proven that people will believe anything that they wish to believe. Even though the hoax was revealed, people still flocked to see the giant, and it was so popular that P.T. Barnum put a replica in his sideshow. So, of course, this story was a hoax, and I apologise unreservedly for that. But it does demonstrate that there is a part of us that wants desperately to believe in giants. We want them to have been real at some point in time. And sometimes these stories aren't just obscure tidbits scattered throughout local newspapers. Sometimes they come from really famous sources. Between 1519 and 1522, Ferdinand Magellan set out to find a good trade route to the East Indies. One of their voyages took them all the way to the southern end of South America. The expedition's official chronicler was a man named Antonio Pigafetta, and he wrote down a strange little tale that was experienced by the crew. He wrote that as they approached the shores of Patagonia, they witnessed a huge man on the beach. He was naked and seemed to be performing some sort of dance on the beach and was throwing sand over his head. The crew were perplexed and slightly afraid. They had never seen anything like this before. Pigafetta wrote, "The Captain General sent one of our men to the giant so that he might perform the same actions as a sign of peace. Having done that, the man led the giant to an islet where the Captain General was waiting. When the giant was in the Captain General's and our presence, he marvelled greatly and made signs with one finger raised upwards, believing that we had come from the sky. He was so tall that we reached only to his waist, and he was well proportioned. The explorers gave this giant man food and drink, and they eventually made contact with the rest of this creature's tribe. They ate together, hunted together, and formed a positive relationship. Until, that is, the explorers decided that they would kidnap two of the creatures and bring them back to Europe. The creatures did not survive the journey, and therefore the crew came back with stories, but no evidence. Later, more reports would trickle in of giants in Patagonia. According to an article in Mysterious Universe, in 1579, Sir Francis Drake's ship Chaplain, Francis Fletcher, wrote of these giants, which were said to be around 10 feet tall. In the 1590s, the explorer Anthony Knivet also claimed that during his time in Patagonia, he had seen some dead bodies of the giants, which were estimated as being around 12 feet tall. And there was another account from the English explorer William Adams, who claimed that his expedition had actually been attacked by uncommonly large natives while rounding Tierra del Fuego. Such encounters fueled further rumours that Patagonia was indeed a land of giants, and these far-out reports would only continue. In 1615, Dutch circumnavigators William Schouten and Jacob Lemaire claimed to have come across a mysterious grave that was filled with the bones and remains of strange beings that would have been around 11 feet tall. In 1766, there was the report that the Commodore John Byron, who had circumnavigated the world aboard the vessel the Dolphin, had come across a tribe of enormous natives in Patagonia that measured an average of around 9 feet tall, and sometimes they were as tall as 12 feet. These reports were true, insofar as that's what was written down at the time. However, academics and explorers in later years stated that the claims of people who were 9 to 12 feet tall were greatly exaggerated. There were some who believed that the claims were exaggerated simply because the explorers believed that no one would be making the journey to be able to correct them. For example, the reports that Commodore John Byron had seen people who were between 9 and 12 feet tall were actually originally written as people who were about 6.6 to 7 feet tall. These giants were likely an indigenous tribe called the Tawalchi people, who were naturally tall, often well over 6 feet tall, and even sometimes over 7 feet tall. They weren't giants, but they were still giant by European standards. In the 1500s, Spanish conquistadors wrote about giants who had been seen by the native people of Peru. Pedro Cieza de Leon wrote that native people reported that giants had appeared by raft one day and had set up camp, digging extremely deep wells. De Leon wrote, "Some were so big that an ordinary man of good size scarcely reached up to their knees. Their members were in proportion to the size of their bodies, and it a monstrous thing to see their enormous heads and their hair hanging down about their shoulders. Their eyes were as large as small plates. They say they had no beards, and that some of them were clad in the skins of animals and others only in the dresses nature gave them. There were no women with them. On reaching this point, they set up their camp like a village, and even in these times there is a memory of the site of their houses. As they found no supply of water, they remedied the lack by making some very deep wells, a labour certainly worthy of record, being undertaken by such strong men as these must have been, to judge by their size. They dug these wells in the living rocks until they came to water, and afterwards they built the wells in stone from the waterline upwards, so that they would last for ages. In these wells the water is excellent, and it is always so cold that it is very pleasant to drink." But of course the story takes a turn. The giants went on a blood-spilling spree, destroying the villages of the natives and destroying the natives themselves. The giants built wells and shelters and were eventually driven away by a bright light in the sky. De Leon believed it. He had seen the wells and the shelters for himself, and believed that there was no way that any group of average-sized humans could achieve this. He wrote, "This is the account that they gave of the giants, and we believe that it happened. For it is said that very large bones have been found, and still are found thereabouts, and I have heard Spaniards say that they have seen pieces of teeth, which they thought must have weighed 1/2 pound when whole, and who had also seen a piece of shin bone of wonderful size, all of which bears witness to the truth of the incident. In addition to this, one can see the places where the sites of their villages were, and also the wells or cisterns they made. I cannot state whence or how these giants came there. In the present year of 1550, when in the city of Lima, I heard that when His Excellency Don Antonio de Mendoza was Viceroy and Governor of New Spain, certain bones of men as big as these giants and even bigger were found there. I have heard too that in an ancient sepulchre in the city of Mexico or somewhere else in that kingdom, certain bones of giants have been found. Since so many people saw them, and attest having done so, it can therefore be credited that such giants did exist. And indeed they may all have been of the same race." In the early 1900s in Arizona, there were a spate of giant bone findings that again sparked people's interest in the possibility that a race of giants once roamed the earth. In 1911, heavy rainfall had caused great damage in Yavapai County in Arizona. A man named Peter Marks ventured out to survey the damage on his farm, and what he found was very strange. Where the flooding had been so severe, the banks of Walnut Creek had burst, and layers of topsoil had been shifted. Marks found a huge bone that resembled a human leg bone. He continued to search his land and found a huge human skull. Mark was reported to say that the skull is of such an abnormal size that if the average man of this day placed it over his head, he could still find room to move it backwards and forwards or up and down with ease, without disturbing his natural position. From measurements taken of the skull, a number 10 hat would be required to fit it. The teeth, several of which are still embedded in the jawbone, substantiate the immense size of the head. They are fully 1/3 larger than those of the men today, and present more the appearance of tusks than molars of the human family. As to the bones, there is no disputing the fact that the owner was symmetrically formed, of immense size and Herculean strength. The thigh and lower limbs indicate at least twice the size of the average man of today. The bones of this monstrous human may have represented a race of men or a single individual. At any rate, the skeleton of the man in my possession is sufficiently complete so that the dimensions, which are astounding, may be accurately ascertained. Marks continued his digging and found all sorts of strange artefacts like axes, hooks, and metal arrowheads and spear points, which would not have been used by ancient native tribes. Like our stories before, there was huge interest in these findings, but Marks refused to allow anyone to examine them in detail, including the Smithsonian, and as a result, the artefacts were, frustratingly, lost to time. Okay, so we're going to stop there because I have 1,000,001 things to say about giants. Like I said, I love stories of giants, and when I was a kid I used to be obsessed with those pictures that you'd see of like giant skeletons that had been found years ago, all of which, as it turns out, were either hoaxes or mysteriously disappeared when attempts were made to examine them further. So here's the first thing that I'm going to say. The first thing I've written down in my thoughts section for this episode is the Nephilim. Right? Now, I don't really have any truck with this, and it really is the basis of the first story that we talked about, which was the story of the planted giant, like petrified giant, right? And it was basically that this Reverend Turk was a revivalist preacher, and from what I can gather about revivalist preachers is that they were kind of I guess a bit like fire and brimstone preachers, and were very like dynamic and gave these really like engaging lectures and sermons, and the idea was to bring people back to the church, right? That was the whole point of these revivalist preachers, from what I can gather. And Reverend Turk was saying, well, there's definitely giants in the Bible because of the mention of the Nephilim in the Bible, and Mr. Hull was like, well, I don't think there is. Actually, I don't think you should be taking it so literally. So the idea is that the Nephilim are mentioned in Genesis, and they're meant to be, I mean, people interpret it in different ways, but they're meant to be the offspring of, essentially the offspring of angels and humans, right? And they became these giant creatures that roamed the land before and after the ark, essentially. Now, from what I can gather, they're only mentioned in the Bible twice. And there are indeed questions over the translation of the word that has been translated into giants, right? Often with translations, a single word can change an entire translation. And we don't always know that a translation is accurate, even down to the individual word level. And the reason why I don't take any heed of this idea of the Nephilim being real or a literal thing that existed is because we know that there are so many elements of the Bible that are batshit. They're just crazy that we sort of don't take literally. I think we pick and choose what we're going to say is literal in the Bible, right? And that changes from person to person, from church to church, from religion to religion, you know? And there are so many things that we just ignore because we say, well, that bit clearly wasn't meant to be taken literally, but this bit clearly was meant to be taken literally. And that's kind of a difficult thing, I think, to get your head around. And I'm also like, if we're taking things literally in the Bible, who's having sex with a biblically accurate angel? And how is that happening? Listen, it's divine, I know, but like, you know, if they've fallen from heaven, etc., are they still divine? I don't know. Like, it's a whole minefield of conversation. And before anybody starts emailing me in, no, I'm not against Christianity. I'm not slagging off anybody's beliefs. I have studied the Bible. I have read the Bible. I have a degree in theology. That is not to say that I am right and you are wrong. It is just to say that I personally don't think that everything in the Bible should be taken literally. And the thing I took away from that story, which was in Arthur C. Clarke's Mysterious World, right? That was where I got that story from, is that I hope that the universe grants me the pettiness of Mr. Hull. I want the pettiness to have a row with somebody and to be so determined to prove my point that I go and get a huge block of gypsum and have it carved into the shape of a petrified human being just to trick people into believing it's a giant and therefore prove that that person is basically willing to believe anything. Imagine the feeling, like we've all been there, when you know you're right about something and you're saying to somebody that's not accurate, and then they Google it and you're right. And that feeling, that smug feeling that you get, it really is indescribable. And I don't think it's comparable to any other feeling. So imagine the level. I mean, he really did go all out to prove that this reverend was wrong. And it's what I love about this story, right, is obviously he went through all this effort to create this giant. You can look up pictures of the Cardiff giant online. It's a very fun picture of all the men sort of standing around very solemnly around this giant. And what I really love is that even after it was all outed to be a hoax, people still went to see it. People were still like, they wanted to see this giant. P.T. Barnum couldn't get the original Cardiff giant, so he made a replica to put in his sideshow. Like, people don't care whether it's real or not. People don't care whether it's true or not. And on a wider scale, we are still seeing that to this day. That there is, all you need to do is fact check. All you need to do is go, I wonder if this is true or not. And then people either don't fact check, where they're like, no, I'm just going to choose to believe that this is true. Or they do fact check and they go, no, but I still don't believe it. And I find that fascinating. I find that it's terrifying in our modern world, but it is also fascinating. And I think as well, right, I'm, reading these stories, and what I really wanted to do was find kind of modern sightings of giants, but I couldn't, because every video report that I found, I can't get on board with because of AI. You don't know what's real and what isn't now based on AI, and based on, you see some of these videos and you're like, well, I know that's definitely AI. And then you see other ones and you go, well, actually, I'm not so sure. So I just thought there's no point in looking at kind of modern giant sightings, because I can't trust that any of them are taken in good faith, if that makes sense. Because, real or not is a whole other story, but at least taken in good faith and not manipulated using AI or CGI or whatever. And I think in terms of stories like the giants of Patagonia and the giants of Peru, for example, like, I think those stories are interesting, and I also think that you have to be really careful with them. So, for example, in the stories of the giants of Patagonia, like the Tawalchi people were very tall. They were an indigenous people who were very tall, and they were, over 6 feet tall, sometimes over 7 feet tall, which is very tall. European standard height at that time was kind of in the 5 foot, and then in the low inches, if that makes sense. So 5 foot kind of to 5'4", like those heights would be pretty standard heights for a European man, right? So of course they would look at these indigenous people and think, whoa, my goodness, you're really tall. They weren't giants. They weren't these huge marauding giants. They were just indigenous people. And I also think that there is an exaggeration, which is very interesting. And I think part of it comes from ego. But I also think it is easy to describe these people as giants because it paints a picture of monstrous, dangerous people, which in turn validates stories that came later that was like, well, big dangerous savages, so we had to fight them and get rid of them. And I think that's a really important thing to remember, that when you kind of add mysticism to a people, so whether that's, these indigenous people are actually giants, they're huge, monstrous giants, dancing naked on the beach, throwing sand in the air, adding that mysticism kind of dehumanizes the indigenous tribes, the indigenous people. And that added layer of otherness makes it easier for colonizers to come in and justify stealing land or taking lives, etc. And I think in those stories as well of Patagonia and Peru, etc., it also sounds like some of these stories are just that classic case of giant stories that are used to explain natural physical anomalies that people don't understand. So it sounds like when De Leon, for example, was hearing these stories of giants that came on a boat and they dug these huge wells, these stories seem to be generational stories, so that the native people are telling these white people that have come along. Do you know, they're saying, hey, this is how we understand how these physical natural anomalies have gotten here, and we think that these grooves in the ground were giant shelters, these wells were built by giants who couldn't access fresh water. And it sounds like that's more likely what is happening with those stories in particular, because he is talking about, De Leon is talking about, yes, I've heard these stories from the natives and I've heard stories of bones and remains, but he doesn't actually ever say that he personally witnessed or saw any of these things. And we have these types of stories in loads of folklore. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, in Irish folklore, there is the story of Fionn McCool, who is building a bridge across to Scotland to fight a giant, and that's how we got the Giant's Causeway. There's stories that Tim has talked about previously, stories from Devon and from Cornwall, where there are giants that are responsible for various items that are on the land, various landmarks, etc. So it's not unusual for ancient people, when they saw a landmark, when they saw an anomaly, a rock formation, whatever they didn't understand, that they rationalised it, understood it as a previous race of giants. And I think that is what is happening here. And I also think that sometimes these stories of giants come from practices that just weren't understood at the time. So, for example, when I was reading about various stories of giants from around the world, the Paracas skulls came up loads of times, which is a really interesting thing to look up, which were skulls that were found that had elongated, the heads were elongated, and nobody could understand why, and they were like, oh my goodness, like these must be a different race of people, etc. When actually we know now that the elongation of skulls by binding was actually quite common in some cultures, and was something that was practiced over, long periods of time. And the skull would be elongated, and historically, and archaeologists and historians don't believe that it impacted kind of brain function or anything like that in any way, shape or form, that it was really an aesthetic thing, and it demonstrated your status in society. But it's understandable that when people first saw those skulls, they were like, what in the world is this? And didn't understand the practice of skull elongation. And I do feel like I'm ranting now, but gigantism is very real too. We know that throughout history there are people that are much bigger than other people, whether that is naturally or whether that is because they have some sort of medical condition like pituitary gland hormones that keep producing and making people get bigger and bigger. We know that throughout time there are people who are just bigger than others. There are some video links in the description of this episode that are just kind of fun videos about giant sightings, and one of them is just a list of people throughout time who are just really big, just really, really big people. So you can understand that back in the day, if the average person is 5'2", and then they find the skeleton of a 7 foot tall person, that would be considered quite shocking, and also these things get exaggerated over time, where 7 foot suddenly becomes 9 foot or 10 foot. And I firmly believe that the skulls found in Arizona in the 1900s by Peter Marks, I just firmly believe that he read the older stories of like the Cardiff giant, and he went, I think there's a way to make money here. And then when the Smithsonian and other scientists were like, we'd like to examine these bones and these artifacts, he was like, shit. Well, actually, I probably can't allow that, because then they're going to know that they're not real. So here's my hot take on giants. I think it is a mixture of a number of things. Misidentification. I think it's a mixture of exaggeration. I think it's a mixture of genuine just hoaxes, just straight up hoaxes. And I think it is a case of also misunderstanding. But I do think it is amazing that these bones, these artifacts of crazy things throughout history, whether it's giants or, aliens, etc., they always seem to mysteriously disappear. like the fragments of UFOs that people claim to have that mysteriously disappear. And I'm going to round off this episode with a recommendation for you, which is a book called The Story We Carry in Our Bones, Irish History for Americans by Juliene Osborne McKnight, or Juliene Osborne McKnight. It's freely available online, I think, and it just bizarrely has come across my path twice in the last week. And I am very excited to get my hands on a copy of it, and it seems to be very good. And I would recommend taking a look if you are interested in the old Irish folkloric stories. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. As always, all of the links to all of my information are in the description of this episode, as well as the link for you to listen to the Chick and the Duck podcast, and I highly recommend that you go and check it out. If you would like to send in your story, you can do so by emailing it to reallifeghoststoriespodcast@gmail.com. You can also check out the website reallifeghoststoriespodcast.com. And if you are desperate for some extra content, you can subscribe to the Patreon. That is patreon.com/reallifeghoststories, where for $5 a month or for $2 a month, you can get access to heaps of extra content, as well as every single main and mini episode completely ad-free. And on that note, I shall see you next time.
If your team isn't using ClickUp, you're wasting time, and data proves it. 61% of knowledge workers manage work more than doing it, switching apps 1,000 times a day. That's work sprawl and costs millions. ClickUp replaces 20 apps with Convergence, uniting projects, docs, and chats, while AI super agents handle the busy work. Join 4 million teams using ClickUp to finish work 30% faster. Try it free and get 15% off AI upgrades at clickup.com/podcast. That's CLICKUP.com/podcast.